Dr Nina Ansary is an Iranian-American author, best known for her work on women's equity in Iran. The New York Times named her as one of 6 women who builds bridges rather than walls. She's appeared on Larry King, the BBC, Fox News, and been featured in a plethora of publications. In 2018, she was appointed UN Women Champion for Innovation to advance women and girls in technology and entrepreneurship. And last year saw the publication of her book, Anonymous is a Woman, which takes readers on a 4,000-year historic journey into the roots of gender discrimination, telling the story of 50 extraordinary but forgotten innovators. Nina, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And it's a bit earlier in the day for you where you are, isn't it?
Yes, thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. I wondered if we start by telling us a little about your journey of how you got here today, starting out with your family leaving Iran on the cusp of the 1979 revolution.
Right. Well, we left Iran like many people did at the time, and we immigrated to the United States. And I really embarked on this journey of my activism, and specifically writing on women in Iran and the global community after I received my PhD in 2013 from Columbia University.
And your work deals with the dominant narrative cultures. Where do you think they come from, and how can we begin to influence them in a positive way?
Well, look, if we want to really go back to the beginning, the dominant narrative which continues to hold women back is the global theme of women's inferiority, which holds women back in policy, law, as well as discriminatory practices, including social stereotypes. That is more or less a universal theme, which is really grounded in the myth that has been perpetuating for centuries. Now, if you go back to primitive society, that wasn't always the case. So specifically, just to provide a broad overview, in primitive society, men and women pretty much had specific roles which they carried out. Men were hunters, women took care of the dwellings. And as agriculture was brought about and the domestication of cattle and large animals, men was sort of emancipated from his role as hunter and able to move into cultural and industrial life and social production. And so man gradually moved into society and took the reins and created new social system that essentially served his needs more than that of a woman's. And this myth of women's inferiority is actually at the forefront of a social history that has reduced women to a lesser status. And it's not biology or as many continue to claim today, that women are less capable in certain fields. So that is really the dominant narrative that continues to have ripple effects even in the 21st century, even in developed countries such as the United Kingdom and the United States, where women continue to be held back by such really mythological myths that continue, and how do we address them? Well, on the one hand, I always say you can eradicate all the policies and laws that continue to hold women back, but what is most difficult to challenge and deal with are social stereotypes regarding women's capabilities. I mean, you can change every law that is working against women, but what is most difficult to really challenge are these stereotypes, because not one person or one organization is responsible for them.
And you mentioned the problems that persist in the countries like the UK and America, fully so-called developed countries. Are you concerned that there is a backlash happening now? I mean,
well, if just broadly speaking, we're talking about the pandemic and the ripple effects and how it's impacted women's rights and the strides that have been made so far. If just to look at just prior to the pandemic, 2019. I always say, words mean one thing and statistics mean a whole different thing. So if you look at the Global Gender Gap Index, which is published annually by the World Economic Forum, they analyze 153 countries with respect to the extent of advancements they've made for women, specifically in the political, economic, education, health, and survival sub-index. And prior to the pandemic, when I talk about this, you get an aha moment. And, usually I talk about women in Iran and how they're held back. But when I say the US in 2019 ranked 51, so it doesn't even rank in the top 10, not even close. And the UK had come in at 15. What's more alarming is that the US had dropped 23 points since 2015. Now, fast forward to the pandemic, the UK has dropped again. It is now comes in at 21, and the US has dropped again and comes in at 53. So then you look at other countries that have advanced despite the pandemic. You look at Spain, which was number 21 on the World Economic Forum Gender Gap Index, and now it comes in at 8. And what factors account for such setbacks and advancements? Well, you need more women in leadership positions. So the more women you have that are, serving as ministers, parliamentarians, political figures, the more you can advance, you hope to advance. And that accounts for Spain making these strides despite the pandemic. Currently, Spain is has the most female-centric government in the entire world. In fact, they have 47% of women in Congress, 65% ministers. Ethiopia has closed 70% of its gender gap. They have actually reached complete parity in their health and survival sub-index. These are areas where countries, seemingly progressive countries like the US and UK lack. We have legalized loopholes, insufficient legislation, insufficient quota systems. And, these are not addressed. And you can see the ripple effects of them when you look at the numbers and the statistics every year, in which you see other countries that are making advancements in the UK, and countries like the UK and US are continuously dropping on those scales. So, you can't advance and you cannot close any gaps until you get more women in leadership positions. And how do you go about doing that? Well, we don't specifically have laws like you do in certain countries that prohibit women from certain positions or from making strides in society. What typically holds women back in countries like the US and the UK are social stereotypes predominantly. And, some people say, well, men in the US, don't think like that. They're not patriarchal in mindset. But these are kind of unconscious biases that men have. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, a Google engineer, I don't know if you remember, came out and said there weren't enough women in science, technology, engineering, and math because they were not biologically qualified as men. Now, for a man in the US to say that is a little bit alarming, especially if you go back and look at the history of the computing workforce in the US. And if you look primarily between World War II and the 1960s, it was actually women who dominated the computing workforce and not men, because women were heavily recruited during the war to help crack codes. And then after the war, went to work for government and other sectors. Now, as the power of computers became more and more evident in the mid to late 60s, you had more men who started to infiltrate this field. And obviously with men came better job titles and better salaries, and women were pushed out of this field. But this narrative that women are less qualified is one that continuously keeps women and girls back from realizing their full potential, which is a completely different story when you look at women and girls in conflict-affected situations around the world and what holds them back. So you're dealing with two completely different obstacles.
And would you like to say a bit about what holds women and girls back in conflict situations?
Well, obviously, you're talking about countries that are impoverished. They have pre-existing patriarchal norms. They have structural gender inequalities. And all these, of course, become all the more magnified and exacerbated during times of crises, such as a pandemic. So what you have, in essence, are practices, harmful practices, which are prevalent, such as let's take child marriage, for example, okay? So child marriage pre-pandemic globally stood at 12 million. 12 million girls every year got married before the age of 18. Now, child marriage not only holds young girls back, it keeps them in a cycle of disempowerment, poverty, and really prevents them from participating in every aspect of society and has ripple effects for generations. So when you have times of crises, families tend to have this perception that girls entering into child marriage provide some sort of protection, not only from sexual violence, but from poverty as well. So right now, if you look at the statistics, in the last year, child marriage has gone up about 500,000. And the World Bank has predicted that if we don't take both immediate and long-term measures, there will be another 2.5 million girls who will enter child marriage by the year 2025. So, you have to look at child marriage also in the US. Child marriage is not just something that is, conducive to poverty-stricken areas. The US is the only OECD member nation that, except for 6 states and Washington, D.C., every other state allows for child marriage if you have a combination of either a judge or parental permission, proof of pregnancy, or premarital counseling. So, we talked about why the US has regressed. Well, these are the insufficient legislations that continue to keep young girls in a cycle of disempowerment and poverty, which means that when they grow up as adults, they don't participate in society the way they should and the way they are able to realize their full potential.
And if we can talk a little bit about Iran, what are the particular problems that women face in Iran, and what are the myths that you've sought to debunk in your work and your writing?
Well, you can pretty much name every obstacle, and the women in Iran are faced with it pretty much. Every gender discriminatory obstacle you can think about. Women's lives in Iran are literally by law worth half that of a man's. A woman can't serve as judge. She can't run for president. Basically, the second status of women has been codified in policy law as well as the Islamic constitution. But that being said, currently, and for the last 20 years, women account for 2/3 of all university graduates. And despite all of the obstacles, have excelled in pretty much every field. Even the first woman to ever win the Fields Medal, also known as the Nobel Prize in Mathematics in 2016, was a young woman who was born and raised in post-revolutionary Iran. That being said, recently, the government and the regime has intensified its crackdown on women's rights activists, handing them harsh sentences for peaceful activism. So they continue to fight an uphill battle with a regime who continuously wants to silence them and push them back into the private domain, because that is where they feel women belong. But at the same time, it's important to note the stereotypical assumptions about women in Iran is that because they live in a predominantly patriarchal society, they are held back and unable to, participate in society in large the way women in the West can, and that is not true. So more homage to those women who, despite all the challenges, continue to excel and hope for freedom and the right to self-determination.
And what has accounted for that ability of women to rise through academia, for example, despite all the hurdles and obstacles that stand in their way?
Well, I always like to say, in order to understand what's going on in present day Iran, you have to go back and look at the past. So if you look at Iran's history, Iran's historical landscape specifically is very complex and convoluted. also its social, cultural, and religious landscape as well. You know, in pre-Islam, pre-7th century Islam, Iran, Persia was Zoroastrian, and that was pretty much men and women were on equal legal standing, equal in society. We had women who ruled over the vast Persian Empire. We had female commanders, female business owners, you know, typically things you did not see in the 3rd century. So in many ways, Iran was more advanced prior to the advent of Islam than even many 21st century societies. So inherently, our women are fighters, and they don't succumb to patriarchal mandates that easily. And they have been, except for certain periods after Islam, they have been fighting for their rights for a very long time. So that's innately inherent within the Iranian woman's spirit.
Lovely. And I just wanted to move on now to your most recent book, which gains its title from that wonderful Virginia Woolf quote, "For most of history, Anonymous was a woman." And you went back over 4,000 years, an extraordinary depth of focus and research. What did you discover in terms of how we're progressing and the rate of progress? I mean, it sounded like we were in reverse from what you were saying a moment ago.
Right. So, you know, one of the reasons I wrote this book was because we all have a tendency to think of, when we think of gender equality, we have a tendency to think of it as linear progression. So the pushback on women's rights, like in countries like Iran, really show how we can't be complacent in our assumption of linear progression when it comes to gender equality and women's rights. The other reason I wrote this book is I wanted to profile the countless women in history, and specifically all prior to 1900, in all parts of the world, who had made significant accomplishments but have been virtually written out of history. Now, why is that important? In researching this book, I found that women account for merely 0.5% of recorded history. Is that a historical accuracy? Absolutely not. Is this why women and girls are held back? Absolutely yes. Because if you look at gender stereotypes are really formed. One is primary areas of socialization as a young child, which was, you know, comes from family, schooling, media, peers. And the other is what you see and what you don't see. So, you know, if you look at, you know, certain segments of society and who's overrepresented, who's underrepresented, that leads to an unconscious bias that you think women are less capable. So there are not enough women in science, therefore women are less capable. They're unconscious bias in those fields. Now, the more you research, the more you find that there are countless women in science, countless women who have, not only in science, have excelled in these typically male-dominated fields, but have been virtually left out of history. And so my intention was to rectify another misconception about women's capabilities, and also set forth the message that these are only 50 women, and there are thousands more. And hopefully, if more and more names come out, if more and more of these women are configured in historical textbooks, specifically in the elementary years, which are the most impressionable years for children, the new generation will not be beholden to such biases.
And what was your favorite story, if you have a, or is that invidious to ask you to choose?
Oh my goodness. Well, I have
big question.
That's if I had to choose, well, you know, a lot of these women were profiled because initially the men in their lives took credit for what they did. It was not acceptable for women to do a lot of these things that they did, and also sometimes just men did that because they could. And so I think one of my favorite stories is about Lise Meitner, who was an Austrian physicist who led in the discovery of nuclear fission in the early 1900s. Her partner, Dr. Otto Hahn, won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and she did not. All credit to Dr. Hahn. He submitted her name 10 years in a row to the Nobel Prize Committee, and they rejected it every single time. So the reason I would say that this is my favorite story is because it shows that, even when men go to bat for women, women still have to contend with other people who hold them back, meaning, as a woman, you're always playing catch up to begin with. If you're continuously held back, you're catching up. And even when you do catch up, there are obstacles such as this. There's no reason why she should not have won the Nobel Prize, but she was overlooked again in history. So that story to me always stands out more than the others because, again, you have a deserving woman, and 10 years in a row to be petitioned is no joke. And there's no reason why she should not. And she's never even posthumously received that award.
That sounds like a campaign in its own right.
Right. Well.
And how did you get the details? Because part of the problem must be that the lives of women aren't recorded in the same detail as men's are recorded. Was it hard to find evidence?
Yes. In fact, one of the women I profiled, Alessandra Giuliani, she was an anatomist who invented a technique to view blood vessels. She's Italian, 14th century. There's actually, because she made such a monumental contribution to a field, again, that is, typically women are told they're not biologically qualified as men to enter these fields. A lot of people actually disputed her existence, meaning they said she didn't even exist. So that she was the most difficult. Of course, in the book, when I profile her, I say that because of the time in which she made such a discovery, in which she invented this rather remarkable and unique technique in the medical field, it's just so not acceptable for women to do something like that a lot of people said, this was a fictitious character, more or less. And the book obviously has used whatever primary sources I could find and actually confirmed that she did in fact exist. And I do negate the other sources that have said that she was just a figment of someone's imagination, really.
And in your own career, have you encountered those obstacles still? Is a high
no. Well, when you're in fields where you're advocating on behalf of oppressed women and also, seemingly not oppressed women, I don't think you encounter many people who come and tell you you're not qualified to speak on the subject, right? So no. But that being said, I have in the numerous conferences I've spoken at encountered many young women who have come up to me and shared, and that's another reason that inspired my book was countless women. I began advocating on behalf of women in Iran, and it sort of segued into the international community because I met so many amazing young women who would share stories with me of how, of their obstacles. They want to go into certain fields. A lot of young girls I encountered had actually gone into the STEM fields, and a lot of these young women leave after the first year. And so I began researching, and I saw that in America, for example, 35% of women who get jobs in the STEM fields end up leaving after the first year. Why? Predominantly because it's a male-dominated bastion. Their contributions are undervalued. They're never taken seriously. And it confirmed and corroborated a lot of the stories these young women had told me, specifically when I was appointed UN Women Champion for Innovation, which is part of the work that we do, is advocate for opportunities for girls and women in the STEM fields, as well as the obstacles and barriers. And in nations like the US and the UK, the obstacles and barriers are not laws that hold women back, but again, these male-dominated bastions that really don't take their work seriously or undervalue their contributions. So no one wants to be in a field where they don't feel appreciated or even included. So, these are issues that are very difficult, unfortunately, to not only challenge, but to how do you overturn something that's not a law?
Absolutely, and presumably it's cultural shift. And in your role for the UN, how well received are your suggestions?
Very well. We're a small group. We work very nicely together. We all have different platforms that we use to advocate and support UN Women's, endeavors towards increasing the number of women in these typically male-dominated fields. So, one of the most important ways to get around this is, enforce quota systems. In these fields. If you look at the countries, so one way you can start to make a difference is you can look at the countries that continuously rank in the top 10 on the Global Gender Gap Index. Those countries are Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Nicaragua, Rwanda, and what accounts for their successes. Why has, for example, Iceland topped the Global Gender Gap Index for 11 years in a row now? What accounts for their success? And it's always the fact that they have quota systems. For example, in Iceland, demands and enforces a 40% women on their boards. In Norway, you have 95% of women in the workforce. What accounts for that? Well, they have paid family leave. They broadly value families' contributions to society, and they make it possible for parents to work and raise children. If you look at the US, is actually, if you talk about paid family leave, is actually, except for 6 states, no state actually has is not obligated by federal law to give paid family leave. So if you compare that to Norway or Finland, for example, Finland, new mothers get up to 3 years paid family leave. Norway, they get 91 weeks. So, you're making it possible for women to work and have a family and contribute to the workforce. And that accounts for the number of women going up and for the gender gaps to be reduced in those arenas. So you have to enforce quotas, you have to have budgeting in place, you have to account for equal wages for equal work. If you globally factor in women still on average with equal education and equal experience on average earn 16% less than men. So, these are things that can be tackled. I'll give you an example. 2 companies recently, Starbucks and Salesforce, enforced equal pay for equal work, and Starbucks and Salesforce recently both reached 100% pay parity. So it can be done, but somebody sitting at the top needs to enforce it. So another way to tackle this is role models. The more role models and mentorship you provide for young women, countless studies have come out on showing the importance of exposure to role models at a young age, the importance of having a mentor in the workplace, all make a huge difference.
And it is extraordinary, that fact. I remember when I first discovered it, when I was writing a manifesto for women, that American women by and large, don't get the opportunity of paid maternity leave. So
right, that's astounding, actually.
Returns to work within 2 weeks of giving birth.
That's the UK, I think, is 35 weeks. Canada is 1 year. It was 4 states, now it's 6 states, I believe, that have passed paid family leave law. Every other state, new moms are entitled to 0 weeks paid maternity leave, which is actually mind-boggling. And this is what I mean by insufficient legislation. You also have to look at all the legalized loopholes. And, if you factor in globally what holds women back, in terms of women's rights, women only have 3/4 of the rights that men have. That significantly blocks them from making economic decisions that are best for their families. It blocks them from, many avenues in life that they can excel. Something like 2.7 billion women globally are barred also from having the same job choices as men. You look at certain countries where women are actually can be held back by their male guardians from undertaking certain positions as well, even if the law allows them to undertake that job. So it's countless obstacles, which when you look at the global gender gap index, globally, we've only closed 68% of the index. That's an improvement over a couple of years ago, because I'll tell you what that translates into. What that translates into is it means it's predicted that at the current rate, the world will reach parity in 99 years. 2 years ago, that number was 108 years. So we have, no question, we have advanced, but it's been very slow. And you also have to factor in that we are going to suffer setbacks from the pandemic, specifically because women are losing jobs at a disproportionate rate, because most of the women-dominated industries have been impacted. So women's jobs, globally, women account for 39% of the working populations and account for 54% of job losses during the pandemic. So that's huge. So if we don't take both immediate and long-term recovery measures, then the consequences will outlast the pandemic for sure.
And of course, when one tries to raise the question of quotas in the current climate in the UK, you get a very strong rebuff that people must be there through their own merit.
I'll give you an example. So back in December, I don't know if
I'm with you. I'm just rehearsing.
Look, Mary, I wish it had some. Well, look, back in December, Paris City Hall was fined by the Public Ministry of Public Affairs in France as an exorbitant sum, something like $103,000 or $4,000 for appointing too many women in senior positions, if you can believe that. Now, historically, there's been too many men in senior positions, and you're now fined in Paris circa 2020 for appointing too many qualified women in senior positions. I actually liked Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, actually said, "I'm happy to announce we've been fined." So meaning to answer your question, you can you have the reverse, which says, well, you have to qualify to get this position. Well, according to the mayor, these women did qualify, but they were fined for being qualified. So I don't really know which way we should go. Any suggestions?
No, the backlash is, that's the backlash. And
right. So even when you're qualified, you're fined. So
I think it's called the lose-lose situation.
Well, look, it can be done. It can be done. As I said, it takes collaboration across different sectors. It takes collaboration between the private sector and human and women's rights organizations. It takes enforcement of gender budgeting. It takes enforcement of quotas. It takes investment in girls' education. It takes, you have to look at the legislation that is embedded but not solidly enforced, So if we want to build back after the pandemic, we don't want to go build back the same way as before, because obviously there were spider cracks, for lack of a better word, in the system. But if you want to build back, you want to build back stronger and better, and embed more concrete reforms, because obviously the current social protection systems are not sufficient. If you look, I'll give you an example. 50 countries currently have no legislation against sexual harassment in the workplace. 123 countries have no legislation for sexual harassment in the educational field. And the numbers just go on and on and on. So you have laws that are not concretely enforced, that continue to keep women and girls vulnerable to harmful practices. And those harmful practices at the end of the day, hold young girls back from achieving their full potential and participating fully in society.
How hopeful are you now that we have a change of administration in America?
Well, first of all, America had its first female vice president. So that is shattering the glass ceiling. And a record number of women are holding seats in both the Senate and the House. And we have a record number of women of color also who are holding seats in the House and Senate. So, like I said, I'm very hopeful because the more women you have in leadership roles, the more you can hope to enact meaningful change, and the more you will be able to see young girls infiltrate those typically male-dominated domains because there are more role models and also more women who can pave the way for them. So I'm very hopeful that these wonderful women who have, all shattered the glass ceiling will pave the way for future generations. We also have I don't know if you're familiar with Generation Z, what's referred to as Generation Z, but they're the demographic cohort that has succeeded the millennials. And they are a remarkable generation because they are disrupting both women and men, the business culture, in the most fabulous way. They are very socially responsible. They believe in diversity. They believe in bringing about impactful change. They use their platform for amazing, worthy causes, and they work smarter, not longer. So a combination of these things make one hopeful. And I always like to look at the glass as half full anyway. So it's important to acknowledge all the advancement, but also not lose sight of the setbacks as well, because that's when you start to lose the momentum you've gained, is when you keep your eye on the good stuff and you lose sight of the bad stuff going on. So you have to look at the sum as a whole.
And not slip into denial.
Exactly.
Now we've had a couple of questions in the chat, which I will bring in, and then I will open it up in case any of our attendees want to ask a question. So we've got a question from Fred Parvenet. At what age should children be taught about gender equality, and what is the most impactful way to have a positive lifelong impact on them?
Well, great question. I know Fred, he's a friend of mine. So, okay, so that's a great question. So, although what primarily holds, okay, let's just be clear. No one, if you agree, is born with any kind of biases. No one is born with limited perspective. It's ingrained and learned early on. So to answer Fred's question, the impressionable years, which are ages 7 to 12, are the years that, primary areas of socialization, family and schooling should get involved and really try to teach children that boys and girls are just as capable in certain fields, that it is, negate the narratives that shape biases from a very early age. The earlier, the better, because early childhood years are impressionable. And the one thing that's important is not only educating young minds, but also the way you speak to young children is important. And I'll give you an example. There's been a study done, and I know I was actually spoken to in that way when I was younger. There's been a study done on how parents and educators tend to speak to young children, specifically when you're talking about math or science, which usually when you're growing up, the boys do better in math and science, and the girls are better writers, and they do better in essay writing and history, sort of the soft sciences. So there was a study that was published a few years ago, and it said that, seemingly benign statements we make to our children. Okay, for example, girls are just as good in math as boys, right? Now, on the surface, this sounds like you're being encouraging. It sounds like you're conveying that boys and girls have equal abilities in math. But because of its grammatical structure, you're actually subtly perpetuating the very stereotype you're trying to debunk. Because if you really look at those words girls are just as good in math as boys, the grammatical structure actually implies that being good at math is more natural and common for boys. So it's one thing to teach and negate these narratives. So how do you challenge the narratives? Is you counter them by, like I said, showing the history of computers and how women dominated the computing workforce. And actually the world's first computer programmer was a 19th century mathematician, Ada Lovelace. So you can counter these stereotypical narratives by showing countless examples of women who have excelled in these fields, and also infusing a lot of these women's voices and experience into history. But the other way is how we need to be careful how we speak to our children, because that in and of itself can perpetuate in subtle ways certain stereotypes that we are trying to challenge.
Thank you. And our next question is from Julie Mellor. And if I could just ask other attendees to pop their questions in the Q&A, the button at the bottom, if they would like to. So Julie Mellor says, my understanding is that Shia Islam provides for equal inheritance, and as a result, there are a significant number of women from wealthy families running large businesses. Is this correct, and what impact does this have on broader society?
In Muslim societies? Well, you know, it depends what region you're from. In Iran, women are not entitled to equal inheritance. In fact, they get less than you know, brother and sister. The brother gets more inheritance. So it depends on the region. So I don't quite understand the question in the sense that if you could please repeat the last part.
I think she's asking whether there are women from wealthy families running large businesses, but I think what's probably comes out of this question is the point I know that you're keen to make, that you can't
generalize all Muslim nations, right? Well, look, you know, women in Iran, for example, women in Muslim nations do run businesses. It's, you know, not against the law. In fact, if you look at Saudi Arabia, as part of their Vision 2030, which is a series of reforms designed to help boost the economy, women have recently been given the right to start businesses, and also they don't need the permission of a male guardian to leave the country or obtain a passport, which they did up until recently. But again, regional differences account for various strides or setbacks in Muslim communities. But again, depending on the region, women in Iran are not forbidden from having businesses or running businesses. Again, that is depends on the region. So if she'd like to be more specific, I could address whatever country she's referencing.
Let's wait and see whether Julie comes back to us. We've got one now from Sarah Yazdi. I am an Iranian American Generation Z women's rights activist. My question is, how can I start the conversation in my local community and high school?
In terms of gender inequality, women's rights, or what specifically start the conversation on stereotypical narratives? Is that the question?
Sarah, if you're there, she's coming back in now. Women's rights.
Well, a good place to start is Iran, since she is from Iran. But a good place to start in general about women's rights, I always say, you know, you have to look at the global community as a whole. So if you look at my go-to place is the annual report published by the World Economic Forum every year that really breaks down every country and what accounts for their advancements and what accounts for their setbacks. That in and of itself provides you with a broad overview. And then you can tackle every country on its own when you look at how they rank in all the 4 sectors I mentioned, and what can be done to reverse some of those setbacks, and what accounts for certain countries that have advanced significantly. And that's a good place to start the conversation. And then another good place to start the conversation is look at, for example, countries like Iran, and what accounts for women excelling despite the circumstances, what factors account, which I covered in my first book, countries that have regressive laws, but women make strides despite all the hurdles.
And I think it looks like Sarah is specifically talking in her local community in high school as an activist. How can she start the conversation where she is now? And it looks as if she's in America.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how within her community, if she wants to start this conversation and play her bit as an activist?
Well, you can start by, putting together groups, having group discussions is always a good place. I know what we do with UN Women is we have panel sessions, and we have young women who are, for example, wanting to go into entrepreneurial field. They come and they discuss their obstacles and barriers, and we guide them, and so do people in the entrepreneurial field who have succeeded in that arena, how to navigate the challenges. So a good way is to, connect with people even on social media to start the conversation. If it's not possible these days, especially with the pandemic, to meet in person, social media group chats is a good place to start.
Fantastic, thank you. And we are coming to the end now. If you had a message to all of us, what would it be? What can we all do going out to try? You talked a lot about cultural and social, the ropes culturally and socially that hold us back. What can we all do?
Well, I always say every one of us can make a difference. So these days, it's more important than ever and easier than ever to raise awareness about such issues, because we have the benefits of technology, namely social media, which makes it easier than ever to connect with like-minded people. So that's one avenue. And I always say, don't underestimate the ripple effects of your message and your voice. So nothing is possible if we don't collaborate. Nothing is possible if there's no solidarity. We can't expect to move forward if we continuously highlight our differences. And we have to dispense with stereotypical assumptions, and also dispense with the fact that what you might see on the outside of a woman does not necessarily define what is inside of her. So every culture is different. Every landscape is different, and to also be respectful of what constitutes varying definitions of womanhood, depending on the region you come from and your cultural heritage. So that is key to advancement as well.
Wonderful. Dr. Nina Ansary, thank you so much for giving us your time and your wisdom and your insights.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. Thanks. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye.